Thank you, Bruno. It's an honor to be here. Thank you to Bruno and the organizing committee for the opportunity to share a few thoughts with you. So Feed the Future, so I'm using a Feed the Future background, is across the US government initiative, which is supported by different agencies, USDA, USAID, and so on. And it's the US government's Global Food Security and Poverty Alleviation Initiative, which was started in the Obama administration and has had strong bipartisan support since then. And so we have led the Livestock Systems Innovation Lab. I've been privileged to be the lead until last year, for about 7 years. And I'll be telling you about the importance of livestock in nourishing the world. And this is really critical because we live in an era where livestock gets such a bad press. And so I want us to focus maybe on some aspects that are not often spoken about. So I'm going to start by talking about malnutrition in the US and also globally, and maybe more particularly globally. And then I'll talk about nutrient deficiencies in children and how they impact cognition. I'll talk about animal source foods, the benefits, the role, barriers to their consumption. I'll talk a little bit about the global importance of livestock. I'll talk a little bit about our work, and then I'll conclude. So if we think about the condition, the malnutrition condition called stunting, this is when children fail to achieve their height potential. So they have low height for age. And normally we think this is just a physical impairment, but stunting underlies a more sinister impact, which is that those children who are stunted have reduced cognitive development. And so those children are compelled or confined or condemned, maybe is a better word, to a lifetime of underperformance and underachievement. And if you look at where that is prevalent in the world, you can see that in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, those are the dominant areas where 1 in 3 children is stunted. And these are averages. So in some of those areas, it's up to 60%, more than 1 in 2 children is stunted. And this stunting means that these children, their brains don't develop well, so they don't do well in school. And it's not like here that if you don't go to college, you can do lawn service and have a fantastic life. It affects those children, it affects their communities, and the World Bank has released data showing that where you have a workforce based on stunted people, the GDP is penalized on average by 7%. In some African countries, it's up to 16%. Wasting is another condition. By the way, the stunting level in the US is 3%, so it's not 0, so it's still important. Wasting is when kids, their weight is insufficient for their age, and this is more closely linked to child mortality. Again, you'll find a lot of this in sub-Saharan Africa, but also in South Asia. In fact, greater wasting levels in parts of Asia, South Asia particularly, and I've read that a lot of that is due to sanitation and hygiene issues. When we think about these nutritional indicators, at least until maybe 10 years ago, I didn't realize there was a link between nutrition and brain development. But what you see here is that there are certain nutrients that are key for certain brain processes and brain development aspects. So protein and energy for cell proliferation, for synaptogenesis, iron for the myelin sheath that surrounds the nerve cells, for synthesis of monoamines, zinc for DNA synthesis, copper for neurotransmitter synthesis, long chain puffers, again for synaptogenesis. So you begin to see that there is an important link between nutrition and cognition or development of the brain. And both WHO and the US Dietary Guideline Association insist that children who are 6 months or older from 6 months old, women should include animal source foods in the diet. And this is because of the rich nutrient diversity and bioavailability that is in these foods. So breastfeeding for the first 6 months is what is recommended, but beyond that, milk is an important recommendation. And then dairy products, and this is the WHO recommendation. If you look at the US dietary guidelines, they actually reference some other animal source foods as well. Why is it that these important dietary guideline groups insist on using animal source foods? So what you have on the left-hand side here in this table is a list of different macro and micronutrients. And if we start with the protein, we're all well aware that the protein in animal sources is usually greater in amount, concentration, whatever way you want to look at it. But again, the complement of amino acids is more complete. And so the quality of the protein is higher, the digestible amino acid score is greater, the iron is more bioavailable, the zinc is more bioavailable, the calcium likewise, vitamin B12 you can't get from plants except from seaweed, and very few people consume seaweeds in quantities that would meet their nutritional requirements. So we can go down the list. Vitamin A, the natural form of A, of D3 and so on are in these animal sources. And this is why WHO says that these animal source foods are the best source of nutrients for infants aged 6 to 23 months. So if we think about the mode of action, there are 3 different aspects. There are a number of different modes of actions, but these are 3 of the main ones. Improved myelination, arborization, which is the branching in the brain, and then improving the connectivity in the synapses. So this is vital, and the animal source foods really have an edge in this respect. The consequences of malnutrition, this is from WHO, in the formative years. First of all, morbidity, mortality, those we would expect, but in addition, delayed motor and cognitive development, also delayed socio-emotional development, non-communicable diseases, so diabetes, overweight, and so this is due to malnutrition in infancy, and over the long term, reduced work capacity and earnings. So who would have thought that just what that infant consumes in the first 2 years had these remarkable lifelong impacts? I mentioned that B12 is one micronutrient that you don't get from the plant sources. And look at the impacts on a pregnant or lactating woman. So what this chart here shows is data with strong evidence, with moderate evidence, and with low evidence. And I'm not going to talk about the low evidence information. But what it shows is that there is a high evidence that if a mother's diet is deficient in B12, low birth weight is going to happen. For that, neural tube defects are going to be prevalent. Then poor cognition, higher adiposity, low offspring B12, higher intrauterine growth retardation. And then the kids are going to have, risk of gestational diabetes. So all these impacts just because of a deficiency of B12. And I don't have time to show how deficient diets of women are in these developing countries. And in these countries, people are vegetarians, and not by choice, but by force, because the macronutrients and micronutrients they need for meat are not readily consumed. In some of these countries, we go there, we ask a child, when did you have a piece of meat last? And they say it's last Christmas. That was like a special thing for me at Christmas. But it's not just infants. It's not just women of reproductive age, but it's also the elderly. So preventing things like sarcopenia, preventing osteoporosis. And so this is a meta-analysis that looked at vegans versus vegetarians versus omnivores. and the risk of fracture at the femoral neck. And what was clearly demonstrated was that in the omnivores, the risk was a lot less. So for the elderly, these animal source foods are also important for increased muscle mass due to the superior protein in the animal source foods. But in addition, and also the calcium, the type of calcium, the mobilization, and the bioabsorption of the calcium for bone integrity. This is a busy slide, and I'm not really going to reference the modes of action which are shown here. But we live in an age where there are a lot of milk alternatives out there. And I'm not here to knock anyone who is a vegetarian or vegan. That's their own lifestyle choice. But I think it's important to know that even if they equalize the protein concentration in the milk alternatives to that in milk, there are many other things that are missing. There's lactose, proteins, vitamins, fatty acids, oligosaccharides, exosomes, and this review paper, which was just published this year, shows that these all work in concert to aid calcium bioavailability, which is vital for bone integrity and for different other processes in the body. So I think, it's something that we need to make sure that our kids, our teenagers are aware of as they choose these alternative dietary preferences. I'm going to share a few studies from the literature that kind of hit home more on the link between diet and cognition. So these are measures of malnutrition, underweight, stunting, and wasting. This is a US study showing consumption of meat reduced stunting, wasting, and underweight in children. So if this is happening in the US, think about the dramatic effects you can have in the developing world. This is another study that showed through a meta-analysis that supplementation of diets of children in Africa and Asia with animal source foods reduced measures related to stunting and wasting. In fact, I didn't have time to include a slide that was showing that just feeding an egg a day to infants in Ecuador who are aged 6 to 9 months reduced stunting by 45%, the greatest reduction on record. This is the slide that changed my life. This is the study that changed my life in 2013 when I first saw this. And this was a study done in Kenya where they were feeding a diet of legumes, beans with corn, and they were supplementing it with either a matchbox size of meat or a cup of milk or oil to provide some energy. And they looked at the baseline test scores in the schools in Kenya, and then looked at the results again after 5 school semesters. And these were averaging their test scores across all subjects. What was remarkable that those who got this little supplement of meat, their test scores increased by 45%. Those who got the extra milk, their test scores increased by 28%. Those who got the energy, there was no increase relative to baseline. Same thing for the control. There were actual decreases. And so this changed my life when I discovered that what infants, children consume can affect their performance in school. And the animal source foods have an edge or have an important role in contributing to cognition and to school performance of these children. This is another study which was showing a cross-sectional analysis of almost 1,000 people showing dietary intake increased with increased cognition in adults. So what you can see here is that the different cognition measures were improved with the greater frequency of meat consumption in the diet. So we can go on and on with different studies showing these impacts, but there is an increasing body of evidence showing that benefits of these animal source foods in the diet. But I want us to remember that the benefits, the importance, the role of animal source foods is not just on nutrition. Livestock have a pivotal central role, particularly in developing countries. So they're important for nutrition, as we mentioned, but then there are a lot of non-food byproducts that are the mainstay of livelihoods. So hides and skins, casings, and so on. Animal feed, pharmaceuticals, drugs. There are all kinds of repellents, pest repellents, pharmaceuticals used in native medicines that are derived from livestock products, cosmetics. And then Jose has really helped me to understand the importance of grasslands and the ecosystem services. And I have a few of those factors here, and some of them Lynn touched on so nicely. But there are also things like bioremediation. There are things like soil health. Lynn mentioned biodiversity and nutrient cycling and so on. But it doesn't stop there. There are the sociocultural aspects. We did a study in Ethiopia where we told women who were in rural areas to replace the wooden urns where they store their milk with stainless steel containers because we thought they would be more hygienic. These women, the tradition is they use tree fronds. They smoke them and use the smoke to sanitize. We discovered no difference in bacterial load. Asked the women, would they prefer to keep the stainless steel? They said, no, take your stainless steel urns. Why? We cannot put our traditional inscriptions and markings on them. So the sociocultural aspect is very important. Livestock are vital for status in many of these countries. For resilience, livestock owning households are better able to withstand droughts, and this has been demonstrated in many studies. Treaties, contracts, a lot of the conflicts you hear of, intertribal conflicts, are related to dowries that young men can no longer pay because they can no longer gather 50 animals, 50 cows to use for their dowries. So there are so many ways in which livestock are vital to the fabric of life. And in some of these countries, livestock, about 80% of the people in the countries are involved in one way or another in livestock production. There are important barriers to consumption of these animal source foods. One of them is obviously climate change, which is causing droughts and, I don't need to talk about but the main thing is that livestock production is getting increasingly difficult. In Zambia, Zimbabwe, they declared a national emergency because of the drought. And in some of the countries, they're actually resorting to killing elephants to provide meat because of the droughts. There are the sociocultural limitations. We worked in a tribe in Burkina Faso where children are told if you eat an egg, you will become a thief in adulthood. We worked with them, changed the tradition, and were able to get those kids to eat 6 eggs a week. So things like that can be very far-reaching. Accessibility, availability, affordability are big issues. In Ethiopia, for instance, the Orthodox Christianity doesn't allow people to consume animal foods regularly because they have over 240 days of fasting in a year. And fasting means no animal source food consumption. So those are some of the important barriers. And we led this Feed the Future program, which is still at UF, over the last 9 years, and which was targeting improving livestock production in these countries and improving consumption of animal source foods. We've been very privileged. It's been a great effort with people like Jose and Ken Buti and Esteban. We've had over 200 publications, but the greatest impacts are what we have done with the people and women who are now having greater income and are able to feed their children better. Because this is an agronomy audience, I will just share a few of the feed and forage related impacts we have, and then I will end. So first of all, Esteban helped us with Jose, and we took Florida forage varieties to Ethiopia, to Burkina Faso, validated them over a 4-year period, got them approved, released by the government. So now they're being adopted in different parts of the country. We conducted feed balance exercises to know the areas of feed excess production and feed deficiency in some of the countries. And so this is in Burkina Faso, and we identified a big deficiency problem in the north, in the Sahel. And so we're working with them to devise strategies to mitigate the deficiency in that area. In both countries, we created feed databases, uploaded information, analyzed up to 4,000 feeds and forages in each of the countries, and helped them to build these feed databases. And these are just some pictures of the database. Labs in most African and Asian countries are just defunct for various reasons. So the potential of handheld NIR is huge. And so we introduced this to them for feed and forage analysis, and in Burkina Faso, for the first time, they're able to label their feeds with the nutritional composition, which is, as you know, is vital for ration formulation, for validating the quality, and so on. And so we introduced both desktop and mobile NIRs. We validated and we formed a public-private partnership so that the private sector is also involved in overseeing the use of the NIR mobile system. We also showed, Lynn showed some of the benefits of perennial forages. We showed that in these forages, in these countries, perennial forages are more profitable than cash crops, which is huge, because this was one of the main things the Gates Foundation was reluctant to fund us for, because they said they would never take this up. Anyway, I'm going to finish with 2 slides on environmental impacts. I'm sure Louise will talk a lot more about this, but I want us to remember and to tell our students. I was at 2 students' PhD exams in the last 2 weeks, and both of them ignored this fact that methane in the atmosphere is short-lived. The lifespan in the atmosphere is about 12 years before it dissipates. So let's remember that, and let's make sure that people know that, so that there is a proper accounting for the impact in the environment, and not just comparing it to CO2. And the second thing is making sure that people understand that we've been working on reducing methane in livestock systems, in grassland systems, for over 30 years. Now, over 100 mitigation techniques exist, and many of those are being applied, but then we need to increase adoption of these techniques. So I'm going to finish by saying that the prevalence of stunting and wasting are still way too high. Here in the US are 3%, never mind in those African countries and Asian countries. Way too high. Animal source foods, because of their nutrient cluster, and in fact I started calling them brain foods. I didn't coin that. Somebody published a paper in Nature and called them brain foods. They are vital. And livestock products have such a bad press. We need to get the word out. We need to make sure that both for here and the developing world, people understand the vital role of these animal products in the diets. Lynn talked a lot about sustainable intensification, so I'm really glad that he hit that. It's exactly what is needed in the global south. And then finally, livestock are part of the solution to climate change, a really vital, indispensable part of the solution. Thank you. Thank you.